changes in the mean. It's identified by changes in the mean and or the variability of its properties. So what are we saying here? That climate isn't it's raining today, it's windy tomorrow, etc. It's an average over usually 30 years. Okay, so when we talk climate change, we're talking about the typical weather of a country within a generation changing. Okay, what we're seeing is there's general warming observed across the globe, and it is due to anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. This is now in the latest IPCC report is without any doubt. It is as scientifically valid as sort of gravity or the theory of relativity of Einstein. It is that strong evidence. In fact, we can see that over time, we've had CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions increasing drastically. You can see especially the pedal was you could say pressed, the accelerator pedal was pressed, especially around the year 1950. You can see a huge rise in carbon dioxide emitted since then. People sometimes wonder if it is mostly because of human emissions or because of solar activity, but you can see from this chart over here that while temperature has been increasing, solar activity has been pretty much staying static, if not decreasing slightly over that time. And in fact, from the latest International Panel of Climate Change report in 2016, you can see the scale of warming we're observing. I invite you to look at the graph to the left. You can see that what we call a hockey stick figure, where you see that massive shoot of warming observed in recent years. And in fact, B, the next graph to the right, shows that if humans weren't around, temperatures would have been around the same. But because of human activity, we've seen observed a sharp increase in temperature. And where are we heading? If countries do not act, we're heading towards a 4 degree to 4.8 degree centigrade rise, which will be devastating for everyone and the biosphere itself. If we follow all current policies, we're heading to around the 3 degrees increase. And if we're following current pledges and these have not been enacted, we're looking at a 2.5 to 2.8 degrees. Currently, the Paris Climate Accords are looking to limit it to 2 degrees centigrade, but we're far from even approaching that level. When we talk about these shifts, what are we talking about? They always sound very, very small, 1 degree, but look at the scale of differences. Where we are today over there, that is a scale showing basically one ice age unit, they're calling it, okay? So a world 4 degrees colder would be a 1 ice age unit. So if you look at -1 over there is 20,000 years ago when there was 1 mile of ice on top of Boston in the United States, for example. You could walk to Sicily from Malta because sea levels were so low, you could do that. However, we are heading straight for +1 ice age. Because as you can imagine, if civilization couldn't survive during the ice age because of the extreme weather of the time, where we'll be heading for? And at this rate, we're heading there in about 80 years. So we have to really start acting on climate change. And that's what one can imagine. Climate change has very significant effects on health. And in fact, on 7th September this very year, more than 200 health journals called for urgent action on the climate crisis, calling it the greatest crisis for the 21st century for public health. This is this highlights how important it is and how urgent it is to drastically reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. One might ask, how does climate change impact health? So it impacts it in very, very, very different ways. We know that this is through complex and multiple pathways. We know that these pathways are significant and measurable. And we know that by the year 2000, around 150,000 deaths were attributable to climate change annually. However, this is forecast to reach at least 250,000 deaths a year by the year 2040. It will probably be much higher than that, but it depends on how quickly we act on climate mitigation. Effects are also felt strongly in all countries, but disproportionately so in poorer countries. I like to categorize climate change health risks in this particular way to make it simpler, and this is the way we're going to follow during this particular seminar. So direct effects. This is a direct biological consequence. So it is hot and I feel hot. the impact of a heat wave on me. There's a strong wind because of extreme weather events, and that causes damage to my home, and the part of the roof falls and it falls on me. So that is a direct biological consequence. Also, air pollution increases due to temperature. We'll go through that briefly. There are also indirect effects. So the bioecosystem, biosphere is affected, and that leads to impacts on our health. So for example, climate change lowers food security, and that lowered food security will have an impact on my health. Same with water security, and same with the spread of vector-borne diseases. And then lastly, but not least importantly, there are diffuse effects. How climate change is affecting society. So because of all the other levels, you get people migrating, for example. You get people fighting over resources. And these have a significant effect on society. So we'll look at direct effects first over here. So temperature enhanced air pollution. So we all have heard about the ozone layer. Now the ozone layer is way up above, and it is very protective for us and is very good for our health. If there was no ozone layer, we'd all be fried to a crisp due to UV. However, there's also ozone on the ground, and that is dangerous. If we inhale ozone, that is harmful to our health. And in fact, what's happening is that while ozone is very rarely emitted by human activity, because of increasing temperatures, different air pollutants are reacting together. And this reaction is leading to ozone being produced. That is leading to respiratory effects and damage to our lungs. This, in fact, is shown to increase the frequency of asthma attacks, for example. It also inflames and damages the airways, and ozone also causes coughing and a sore or scratchy throat. So this is increasing because of increasing temperatures. We also have rising temperatures that have an effect, direct effect on us. So for example, the vulnerable population are especially at risk of discomfort, heat stress, and heat stroke. We've got dehydration. We've got increasing cardiovascular disease risk. All these problems are directly linked to increased temperatures. This year has been quite the wake-up call. We've had massive wildfires around the world. There's a photo there of a woman absolutely desperate after her house was burnt in Greece, for example. In Canada, there I found one showing 46.6 degrees in Lytton. It actually reached 49.6 degrees 2 days later, and the town burned down. It doesn't exist anymore. So we're looking at huge temperature spikes. In Malta, we had 3 very extensive heat waves. And in fact, that graph is from the IPCC document that was published 3 weeks ago. And it shows the risk of 50-year events being more likely as temperatures increase. We'll go through that in a bit. I want you to look at the graphs to the left over here. To the left, you can see graphs over there. Those are temperature mortality graphs. So you've got the x-axis over there shows temperature, and the y-axis shows the risk of dying. Okay, so for example, 2.0 means your risk of dying at that temperature is twice as much as the most at the lowest, which in that case in London, for example, is about 20 degrees, 19 degrees centigrade. Okay, and as you can see, as temperatures increase, the risk of dying rises drastically, and that is a pattern that U-shaped or sometimes W-shaped pattern is found around the world across cities. Note, for example, that in Stockholm, you've got a very flattened cold curve. Why? Because people are very adapted to cold over there. Whereas in London, we can see that the housing is not very adapted to cold. Now, Malta's climate, I'm going to focus on Malta for a bit, has been getting hotter over the last century. It was already 1.4 degrees centigrade hotter. In fact, these are things we're experiencing in Malta today. There was a case of about a month ago, there was a very extensive heat wave. There were cancer patients who suffered the power cut. And because they couldn't bear to be in the heat of the home at night, they had to spend the night in a hotel to escape the power cut because they didn't have a generator. You've got warnings for people to stay inside as temperatures soar. And to the right, that is not from Malta, but it is something we start facing in Malta as well. You get asphalt melting. That is how hot it is. And importantly, because temperatures are so high during the day, during night, our building materials take time to let go of that heat. So of course, we get accumulating heat over time. In fact, if you look at this chart over here, focus on the 50-year event. We are heading to a more than a 3-degree increase at this point, unless we start reducing climate emissions drastically, carbon emissions drastically. And in fact, we're looking at the likelihood of 50-year events to increase by 14 to 40 times. That means that you will have an extreme 50-year event heat wave, as we call them today, once every 2 years. So this is very, very worrying, of course, from a public health perspective, not to mention discomfort. Interestingly as well, temperatures have been linked to increased aggression. The hotter it is, the more people are likelihood to be aggressive. So if you find yourself being snappy during a heat wave, there's a reason for that. Extreme weather events. So needless to say, when there's extreme weather events such as storms or storm surges or high waves or heat, etc., you get damage to people and infrastructure, and everyone is at risk from these events. You get the disruption of quality community life, you get the destruction of infrastructure, and the direct risk to our health. Sea level rise. Now, while this might not seem very direct, you do get a direct effect because as sea levels increase, that increases drastically the risk of, for example, a storm surge during a storm. So of course, if before you were just below a certain level, now if the sea has risen above a threshold, suddenly the population is at risk of extreme weather event damage. And in fact, in Malta, we had a case, for example, of a bay that was washed away, top and bottom over there. Same bay, just 2 years ago, it was wiped out in a single storm. Shall we start losing our coastline assets, for example? And how will that affect us as a culture? You know, how will that affect beach infrastructure, for example, and people living on the coast? We also get an increase in allergens. So what's happening? We see that as temperatures increase, spring starts earlier, plants start blooming earlier, and they have a longer growing season. That leads to more pollen, that leads to more allergens. In fact, we've also observed that beyond temperature effects, more carbon dioxide is leading to more pollen. So for some reason, plants are producing more pollen the more carbon dioxide there is. So we're going to expect far longer allergen season and far more intense ones as we keep on emitting carbon dioxide. Now we'll start looking at indirect effects: food security, water security, and vector-borne diseases. And here is where I start comparing Malta to, for example, Kiribati, which I'll get to very shortly. So in Malta, food security. Malta imports the vast majority of its food. We already do not produce enough food to feed ourselves by a long shot. And climate change is worsening our ability to grow food. And the agriculture sector is already facing huge pressures from overdevelopment, for example. So we found out in the past few months that in April 2020, the port of Genoa in Italy was facing a strike because of workers who, had because of COVID, etc. And what we found out, what wasn't told to us in Malta, was that a lot of our food comes from Genoa. So actually, a minister said, Malta was facing a major food crisis last year. It made my blood run cold. Malta was facing a huge food crisis. Thankfully, it was averted, but it brought food security to the attention of the local authorities. They've long been putting it off. However, now I'm going to jump to the far side of the world and go quickly to Kiribati. Why Kiribati? It's where I carried out my research. So over there, we're looking at the Pacific over there, and we're zooming in. And as you can imagine, the Pacific is a vast region, mostly ocean. But there are many small island nations over there, and the islands come in roughly two main types. You've got volcanic islands and atolls over there. I'm going to focus on Kiribati. So Kiribati, I'm saying Kiribati not because I'm saying it wrongly, but because TI in Kiribati language is S. So it is actually Kiribati, not Kiribati. So it's got many islands. Around half the population lives on one atoll, which is South Tarawa, and they're an independent country, and they're classified as a least developed country by the United Nations. We're going to focus on one group of these islands called the Gilbert Islands. So as you can see, they're basically very thin strips of sand. As you can see right over there, maximum width 300 to 400 meters, and maximum height above sea level is about 3 meters. They have a very fragile freshwater lens. Limited land is available for food. They have very limited infrastructure, and it is a remote country. So food takes a long time to get there, for example, if you're going to ship it there. I did my study in these 3 locations, 3 islands. So you've got South Tarawa and North Tarawa. You've got Butaritari and you've got none O's. And over there, you can say I compared urban and rural populations. Why? Because urban populations are mostly reliant on imported food, while rural populations mostly grow their own food and eat it, what we call subsistence. Now, I invite you to, I call that an anchor. To the left of the slide, there is the future of farming 2050s. Those are all the impacts. So while I'm going through these slides, you can have a look at that over there. Then in the meantime, that is me 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, having arrived in Kiribati, and suddenly the sea, there was a king tide event, and the sea just rose up to my knees. It rose up even higher than that you're seeing on the photo. How does that affect the people of Kiribati? They are quite used to it, but king tides are on the rise. The sea walls are starting to fail. What's happening is the crops are being destroyed, and we're going to see how that affects health. In fact, those are photos from the place where I was living. I was basically stranded in the home for half the day for over 3 days. And beneath me, there was a clinic. It was absolutely flooded, and they had to throw away lots and lots of health products, which were contaminated by the inflow of the sea. However, when it comes to food security, I want you to look at this particular image. Those are the same tree. That is a breadfruit tree. Breadfruit is a main staple of the Pacific. And over there to the left, you can see the breadfruit tree 1 day after that king tide event, and then 1 week after that king tide event. And you can see it's been basically denuded of all its leaves. Why? Because the salinity that entered the soil has basically affected the tree to the point that it lost most of its leaves. To the lower left, you can see a papaya tree over there growing, and it's being killed off. Now, the breadfruit tree will recover. Why? Because it rained very heavily 2 days after the king tide, so the salt water leached away. So that is good news for the big tree. The papaya tree, it's dead, it will not recover. But when it comes to the breadfruit tree, it will take at least 4 to 5 months for those leaves to grow again. What's going to happen? People say, okay, I lost my source of food, so now I'm going to turn to imported food. And in fact, that is leading to a problem. So we've got here, for example, seawater intrusion, and that makes people turn to imported food. And this imported food leads to a rise in non-communicable diseases. What are non-communicable diseases? I'm going to go into them. We're seeing a sharp increase, for example, in diabetes, in cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. All these diseases have a drastic public health burden in Kiribati. I'll give you an example. The most common reason why people enter surgery in Kiribati is cited to be lower limb amputation. So basically, people enter hospital to get the lower limbs chopped off. And the reason is because of diabetes, which is so bad that it turns gangrenous, and they have to remove the legs. So you can imagine the level of disability and anguish this is causing, not to mention many other problems. I remember a colleague I was working with, he was 18, 19. His father died at the age of 33 from a heart attack. You know, you get all these problems happening. And you can see a shift from 1990 to 2016. You get what were once the most common diseases were communicable diseases. You had diarrhea and neonatal disorders as a genetic disease. And then it is now the biggest reason for disability in Kiribati are cardiovascular diseases and diabetes. These are very worrying trends. And in fact, the Western Pacific region has among the highest rates of non-communicable diseases deaths under the age of 70. In fact, Kiribati, just let me see. Oh, it's not, the highlight is not arriving, but Kiribati is actually number 2. So if you look at the right of that graph over there, you will see it comes straight after the Marshall Islands, which are neighboring islands in the Pacific. Water security. So I'm going to talk here briefly about the Malta, jumping back to the Maltese situation. And basically to the left is a map of all the boreholes known in Malta. 8,000 boreholes, and we have only 3,500 which are being metered. Malta doesn't have any rivers. Malta relies entirely on rainfall and groundwater to be replenished by rainfall. But what we're getting is already a system that is already facing abuse of over-extraction. However, climate change comes in to make it even worse. In fact, look at the Mediterranean region over there. Drought is increasing. This has a negative effect on agriculture and is increasingly reliant on desalination. Now, desalination, which Malta is reliant upon for 65% of our water, okay, is a highly energy intensive activity. So what happens, for example, if there's a fuel crisis? What will happen to Malta? This is a national security issue. In fact, again, I invite you to look at the graph to the right. Drier places will become drier and wetter places will become wetter. And drier places, we're seeing that drought conditions, a 10-year event, is likely to increase by 2 to 4 times the way we're heading. So very worrying outcomes indeed. In Malta as well, we also have the problem that we have lots of valleys that are overbuilt, and therefore we get lots of flooding and lots of the water is lost to the sea. So this is a case, for example, of mismanagement and how the current way we do things is having a very negative effect on our future. Jumping away to Kiribati, I want you to look here at this particular map. So this, I would go to a community and I asked them, please draw your community and tell me what's important for you. And look over there, above the word mangrove over there, there is a circle with like 4 green crosses around it. That is a well. And the green crosses represent the efforts done by the villagers to defend it from being contaminated by seawater intrusion, marked in red. And as you can see, what's happening in these communities is that you're getting extensive seawater intrusion. The villagers are trying to protect the community from that, but it's becoming increasingly harder, especially because the freshwater aquifers are being contaminated by saltwater as time goes by. We also go to vector-borne diseases. So what happens is that whereas before, for example, malaria could, the malaria-carrying mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito, could not survive in a certain place, now it is doing so because of increased temperatures. So we get a spread of increased mosquito-borne diseases such as malaria, dengue, West Nile virus fever, and chikungunya disease, for example, and also a spread of ticks disease. You've got Lyme disease, Mediterranean spotted fever. In Malta, for example, we've started getting the Asian tiger mosquito. This was first reported in 2010, but it is now very common in Malta. And while we haven't had cases reported of malaria or other diseases, they can carry these diseases. So once we start getting the spread of diseases, these mosquitoes can spread them in the German population because they will already have been established. And then we move to the more diffuse effects. We're looking at mental health, we're looking at migration, I'm looking at conflict. And I want to stress this very importantly, mental health. You get people mocking young people for being alarmist about climate change, but it is hardly alarmist at all. The situation is actually very worrying. If you want to call young people alarmists, so you would call the top medical journals in the world, if I want to remind you in the beginning. And there is greater anxiety due to ecological breakdown. There is a loss of culture and community, and there is increasing hopelessness in the future. I want to cite Greta Thunberg over here, where she says, why should I be studying for a future that soon may be no more, when no one is doing anything to save that future? And what is the point of learning facts when the most important facts clearly mean nothing to our society? She's here talking about lack of political action or political failure to act. And these are significant problems that we're facing today. We keep hearing about how climate change is a problem, but no one is willing to take action on it. Migration presents itself as an increasing problem. So because it already is happening today, you've got very vulnerable regions on the world due to climate change that are worsening because of drought, because of tension over resources, and you get mass migration of people. And in fact, by 2050, if no action is taken, we'll see more than 143 million internal climate migrants across these 3 regions in particular. That is 3 times the figure of World War II refugees. So it's a huge movement of people. And you already were worrying about a few million in 2015, if you may recall, from Syria entering into Europe. That is a piece of cake compared to all these numbers that we're going to face. And this goes to show how we need to help these countries to adapt to climate change and to urgently mitigate it, because we're going to face many problems with migration. This also leads to conflict. So climate change leads to disasters, leads to migration and displacement, ethnic conflict. In fact, Syria, the Syrian civil war, is sometimes attributed to a massive drought that led to ethnic movements within the country that led to conflict. Got tensions arising, got a scrabble for resources, and that you lead to conflict. They say that the Third World War, if it happens, would be fought over water. And that is a significant problem, where they start hearing tensions about how, for example, Egypt and Sudan, South Sudan, are fighting with Ethiopia, because Ethiopia has built a dam on the River Nile. And they're not trusting Ethiopia that in the event of a drought, they would still release the water that will replenish the Nile, which would kill off Egypt. So we've got all these problems over there. So we've talked about all these problems. Let's look at a possible way forward. First of all, the scale of what we're facing, the reductions we need in carbon dioxide emissions is absolutely huge. That chart over there shows the reduction in carbon dioxide when everyone was locked inside. You had, well, everyone, we're looking about 40% of the world population was locked inside during those particular months. And we only saw a 17% decrease in carbon dioxide. So we're talking about huge drops. These have already been reversed. And in fact, we're going to see an increase in carbon dioxide emissions this year, yet again, as has happened year on year on year. This is a significant problem because we actually need to start reducing our carbon dioxide emissions by 8% annually, cumulatively, if we are to keep the world below 2 degrees centigrade of warming. We have already reached 1.1 degrees. We also have public health strategies to tackle climate change. Ultimately, we need to synchronize well with other entities in order for us to really tackle public health concerns and climate change and deal with climate change effectively. So, for example, we need sustainability transition. We need to enter into a better agricultural system, one that is not reliant on intensive agriculture, which emits a lot of carbon and causes so much damage to our biosphere. So we are talking about a win-win situation where if we tackle public health concerns such as air pollution, we'll also be tackling climate change, for example. Here, in fact, there is a chart showing the role of the health sector in climate change mitigation policy and adaptation. So, for example, you've got the limiting of carbon footprint related to the healthcare system. That is a direct mitigation of climate change. But then, for example, you've got adaptation to lessen health risks. Provide adequate healthcare, for example, anticipate necessary surge capacity when there were, for example, heat waves. We've seen this happening with the COVID crisis, where in the event that we saw a wave arriving, some wards were put aside preparing for that surge in patients, for example. So we should do so for heat waves, for example, when we know that they're coming. Now, my argument here with this graph is looking at the current, for example, disease burden. So without any action on climate change, we're going to see huge impacts on public health, as we've gone through already. However, if we start tackling the health impact averted by mitigation, for example, if we start tackling climate change, we're going to start tackling public health worries that are on the increase. If we start adapting, for example, our buildings, making them more insulated, we're going to avoid having a health impact that currently exists. So overall, if we tackle public health concerns due to climate change, we'll also be dealing with concerns that have to do with mitigation and adaptation vis-a-vis climate change directly. In fact, I have some practical suggestions. For example, in Malta, we'll have a huge urban island effect. You can see it also in the UK in some areas. So when you don't have any tree cover in our streets, you're going to have temperatures that are much, much higher because cement obviously absorbs so much more heat. That we need extensive greening of urban areas. When I say your policies have failed, this is because it's from a chart I showed to some politicians yesterday. I want to stress the fact that their planning policies have failed. And in fact, in Malta, the current policies are a disaster for Malta, and I really push for them to work on them. And this has real world health implications that are far beyond mere aesthetics, which is what we often talk about in the Maltese context. We need to build buildings that are suited for human habitation. Okay, we can't just cram as much living space in a tiny area as much as possible, plonk in an air conditioning unit and expect people to thrive over there. You know, what happens when the power goes out? What happens when people, you know, can't really go outside because the landscape is too unbearable to be outside because of the heat, for example. How is that going to affect their health, the mental health even? No to intensification of activity. I'm showing here one current case in Marsa Scala where there's a big fight against a yacht marina in the village of Marsa Scala in Malta. And what is obviously wrong needs to be rejected. By obviously wrong, I don't merely mean the community doesn't want it. I'm talking about intensification of activity. We cannot keep on working with the mantra of growth at all costs, the GDP at all costs. We can't talk climate change and then consider projects that inevitably increase fossil fuel use. In the UK, for example, there was the high-speed railway. That was highly objected to. Same with the third Heathrow runway, I believe, was not the second, no, third Heathrow runway. That was highly objected to, partly on climate change grounds, for example, because we can't keep on having the same activity that increases carbon emissions while talking about taking climate action. It's counterintuitive. We need to create more habitable spaces. So we're talking about green infrastructure, well-insulated buildings, well-aerated buildings. And please, as I say, design, don't cram. In Malta, for example, we have a big problem with bikeways that go from nowhere to nowhere. We don't have a joint bike system. And I always encourage the government and other policymakers to really work on improving our infrastructure to encourage people to have a commute. Remember, if you use a bike, you're not emitting carbon, whereas if you're using a car, you are, for example. So we need to motivate people to start having more active commutes that use less carbon dioxide. Reminder, cities and roads are for people, not for cars. Okay, so you can here see that the transport sector, which is actually 15 to 25% of all carbon emissions as a sector, that is an area we need to really work on as well. We need to talk about regreening and rewilding. Here I'm showing two particular cases in Malta, but you can see that the rewilding argument is increasing drastically in the UK as well, for example. So you don't need to turn something into a garden, just let it rewild on its own. You get wild forests growing again, that locks in carbon. And that is better also for our mental health because it allows us to go to open spaces, etc., while also boosting our biodiversity, which is so important in the web of life, that is so important for our health. Here, I want to stress from a public health perspective, the health in all policy approach. Okay, so what is this approach? It is an approach where, as public health practitioners, we want to insist on being on decision boards that have to do with planning, for example. Why should we only give planning to an architect when they sometimes ignore the health implications, for example? Why do we compartmentalize? I remember one particular case, in my case, I had gone up to the Minister of Health here to do a study on air pollution. And I was told, well, but that's environment. And then I went to the environment minister and he said, oh, but that's health. So what's the message I got? There is no transdisciplinarity. And that is something we absolutely need. We absolutely need. We need to work across sectors to address climate change and improve public health outcomes. Food security. We need innovation in a dying sector. I'm talking about Malta over here, where we have a dying agricultural industry. We have a lot of our fields being taken up for development. We've got lots of farmers giving up and recreational farmers coming in who often don't cultivate the land properly. And we need to treat water security as a major security issue, even for food security purposes. So we also have a situation where we have lots of supermarkets cropping up all over the island. And consequently, there's very few places to grow local food, to sell local food. And that is a problem, not only because it leads to, it discourages the agricultural community, but also because it leads to a rise of NCDs, because you're neglecting fresh produce and looking for produce which often is of a lower quality, which has an impact on our health. There are options to look at. For example, hydroponics on the top over there is a way of growing leafy veg, for example, using far less water than if you grow on a field, 90% less. There's also systems of agroforestry, where you're not only locking in carbon, but you're increasing biodiversity in a field, while also helping your crops grow anyway. So these are plus systems. You also have water security issues. In Malta, one of the most water-stressed countries in the world with 92% rating. To put you in the picture, it's one of the top 10 water-scarce countries in the world. And in fact, we're even worse than Kuwait, for example, which is in the middle of a desert. Being over-reliant on desalination is not a solution. It is a water crisis waiting to happen. And lastly, I'd like to go into the mental health concerns of climate change. Please take the concerns of young people seriously. Climate change worries are not a joke. Many young people are very, very afraid of what's facing them and during their lifetime. You know, we get young people saying, why should I bring children into the world when things are getting so dark and desperate, you know, climate change? And while it might sound extreme, it is a very valid concern. Would you want to bring your children into a world where things are getting pretty grim when it comes to the environment, for example? Eco-anxiety is on the rise because of inaction from politicians. We also need, from a public health perspective, to really start taking this issue seriously and training experts in the field to help young people cope with these concerns. And my last slide is a speech from 2 days ago. Greta Thunberg, not my penultimate slide, sorry. Greta Thunberg saying, blah, 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 green economy, blah, blah, blah. She's mocking politicians over there. And she says, our hopes and dreams drown in the empty words and promises. And it's true. She's been talking for 4 years. Experts have been talking for decades. And in 30 years of us knowing about climate change, carbon emissions have only increased year on year on year. We need to look not just at our good, not even at the public good, but the planetary good. We are chipping away at our life support systems, and we need to really start thinking about how that's going to affect us in the future. And my last slide is this one, a sort of tongue-in-cheek slide. What if it is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So all these concerns that we're talking about, if we start turning to a green economy, a healthier one with what we call donut economics, for example, that recognize planetary boundaries, we can shift to a better, rather than measuring GDP, we start measuring well-being, for example, and health as an index of well-being of a society. You know, why not? So if we start shifting towards such a world that tackles climate change effectively, there will be very good public health and well-being outcomes. So my point is, you know, what's there to lose except money from fossil fuels, to be honest? So we really, really need to start working on these issues. These are my references for this presentation, and thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Cauchi, for such an informative presentation. Definitely lots to think about and also great takeaways for all of us, I think, that we can also apply on our day-to-day lives in order to contribute to the environment, obviously, and climate change. At this point, I would like to open the Q&A. I invite you again to post your questions using the Q&A button in the middle bottom of your screen. And I will read them out on your behalf. We'll give a minute or so. Okay, so we have our first question. What else, in brackets, other than avoid compartmentalization, can university public health institutions do, or what would you like them to do more?
Okay, so first things first, and this is a movement happening around the world. You've got universities that are slowly divesting away from fossil fuels. So what is divestment? So basically you've got many universities have shares and investments in fossil fuels, and you cannot, I mean, look at the irony of this. You've got these educational institutions which are showing through the physics departments and health departments how drastic climate change is and its effect on our health and well-being. And then they are investing in the very things that cause damage to it. So what's happening and what we need to do is really push for this. I remember doing my PhD time in Australia, I was quite adamant about this. There was a whole movement going on. Australia suffers, for example, with many of universities investing in coal, and we told them this is unacceptable. This is absolutely unacceptable. You keep saying we need to produce research on climate change, and then you're funding the very thing that causes damage. So that is one thing. Secondly, we need to stop. I believe it is our duty from a research point of view that we need to not just publish for academia, but we need to go out there and talk to our politicians. We need to really be active, and not just be active, to start collaborating with other entities. Okay. One thing I always say is, I wish I could have gone into it, but that's another topic. We need to stop over-medicalizing problems. You know, I mentioned the food security problem leading to diabetes. And I remember I had gone to a very good conference at the University of Queensland, and they were discussing public health outcomes in the Pacific. And they were talking about, you know, there's diabetes on the rise, etc. And there were these top clinicians, top-notch professors in Australia going on about how important it is to increase diabetes screening, etc. And at one point I asked them, but if I may, aren't we over-medicalizing the problem? Because we're not solving the problem here. The problem is the food system. The food system is wrong. The food system is poor. We do not know enough about their lifestyle preferences and what food they prefer, and what we can do to create healthier food or provide access to healthier food which they would like. And people are like, yes, the problem is the food system. And that is why we need to really look at a public health perspective to these problems. Because I'll give you an example in Malta, the obesogenic environment, an environment which is conducive to obesity. Okay, when you create an ugly environment, you're not going to, you know, motivate people to go for a walk. So they're going to stay inside. They're not going to exercise. Some of them might be stressed. They start eating chips and things that, you know, provide quick satisfaction, and that's it. So you get poor diets developing. So a public health perspective can really be married to an environmental perspective. These are some of the things I would look at.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is, how can we address detention and prioritization for public health when they have such a focus, COVID over climate change?
Well, I would contest that, because actually, as time is going by, the strongest statements that, okay, if we thought the COVID pandemic was a problem, let alone climate change comes along, you know? Yes, right now there's a big focus on COVID and getting that done. But the medical journals, 220 top-tier medical journals on 7th September this year came out and said climate change is the biggest threat that we have. And they're telling governments, because COVID provided such an opportunity for us to change our economies and shift towards a greener one, we should take this opportunity. So the international community is very cognizant of how climate change is affecting us. In fact, I remember when I started studying climate change and health over 10 years ago, some people were saying, why are you studying such a fringe subject, etc. And I told them, well, unfortunately, climate change is not going to go anywhere. It's only going to get worse unless we start acting on it. Mm-hmm. And I'm sad to say my gamble worked. And now there's a climate and health unit at the WHO. There's lots of cooperation among international institutions. So I would say that public health is very cognizant of climate change concerns. I wouldn't necessarily say so in the Maltese context. That's what I'm pushing for all the time. As far as I know, I'm the only one really pushing for this in Malta. But abroad, I mean, we've got doctors joining Extinction Rebellion in the UK, for example. It couldn't be a stronger statement. They're doctors doing a die down where they do a sort of mock death in front of the financial institutions in the City of London to make a statement.
As a follow-up question, and it's a part comment, part question, there needs to be action taken at grassroots level, as government institutions seem to be so incapable of identifying, let alone addressing, the multiple issues you have highlighted. How can we take the initiative and embed the change we need to see now, rather than wait for change to cascade down through social structures?
Speak out. Speak out about climate change and health concerns. Talk to your patients about this. Talk to your family about this. Talk to your neighbors about this. You know, I'll give you an example here. In Malta, we all commute all the time for the slightest thing by car. And when I came back to Malta, I said enough of that. So I started cycling, for example. And then I come back home or I visit my parents. My parents would say, my God, you made it in just 15 minutes. That's shorter than if I get a car, park, etc. You know, there are many, many things we can do. to start motivating people to change. But importantly, and I can't stress this enough, is that we need to be more frugal. That is the reality of it. We cannot keep on shopping, 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 and consuming like there's no tomorrow, because there will be no tomorrow if we shop till we drop at this point. We'll be dropping dead because of climate change if we do not start acting upon it. So we need to start challenging things from the bottom up. We need to start telling people, why are you shopping for 100 clothes when you use 2? Why are you going on a shopping spree? Why are you obsessed about getting that biggest car with the biggest engine and driving it up the road when you just need to, use a bicycle, or at most get in a small car or an electric car if it really needs to be that case. So we need to start speaking out and speaking out loud about these things. And do not underestimate the power of speaking up to politicians. Just yesterday, I was presenting to the opposition party about climate change and health concerns. Many of these slides were from there, for example. We need to speak out, and we need to speak out repeatedly. And talking in the UK context, I'm no fan of Boris Johnson. He was a climate denier 4 years ago, and now he's a big fan of climate change and climate change action. And, but he's a bit of an opportunist. But I think it's important for us to really put pressure on them. We need to tell them, this is of great importance, and you are not serving us. We elected you, not the businessmen. We elected you, not the fossil fuel interests. And it's crucial for us to do this. And also, we need to also tell people that, no, there won't be a pie in the sky. We always believe there'll be a silver bullet somehow that will magically suck carbon dioxide out of the air. And the only one I know of that works very well is a tree, for example. But we're chopping those down. So really need to push for change, talking to our neighbors, talking to our communities, and talking to our governments.
Great. Another question at QM for education around climate change is already being introduced into the curriculum. This leads to a clear question. We need to educate our colleagues who will not have benefited from learning the issues that future students will gain from. Are the decision makers, but least educated? ?
I wouldn't say least educated. I think it's more a case of learning to join the dots. Okay, and I go back to the very clear case I gave of the University of Queensland when I was at that conference. We can be the top professors. These people are top-notch academics, but when we mentioned diabetes as a problem, they spoke about how we need to increase screening. Fine, but that is not solving the problem. The problem is the food system. The problem is the environment is worsening, and that is impacting the food system, and people have no option but to eat rice all the time. Rice, which doesn't even grow in the Pacific. In Kiribati, it doesn't grow, for example. They rely entirely on imported rice, which is the main staple now. I mean, it's mind-blowing how something so clearly obvious, when I see the problems that we have in Malta and Kiribati and so many other countries, we get a sedentary lifestyle. We're talking about food options. We're talking about an obesogenic environment, etc., etc. The obvious thing we need to do is encourage A, behavior change, and B, tackle infrastructural problems that have to do with this. I'm talking not just hard infrastructure, but soft infrastructure, But instead, we want to medicalize a problem. That is not going to solve the problem. If you want to reduce the number of people getting lower limb amputations in Kiribati, for example, sure, you can do that by increasing screening of diabetes and catching it earlier on. But you can also do it by changing the diets, improving the food that they're eating, encouraging local food production. All these things are pretty obvious when you think about them. You just need to sit back, say, okay, climate change is bringing these problems. How will this affect us? Boom, you make the links. And I think that, more than anything, really makes a difference. And on this point as well, we need to be more transdisciplinary in our work. As academics, as researchers, as people in the street, we need to be more transdisciplinary. We cannot keep on seeing things in isolation. If we see things in isolation, you're missing the picture. If we're looking at air pollution as an environmental problem, you're missing a big part of the picture, because our pollution kills hundreds and thousands of people every year. you know? So we need to really tackle it from all approaches. And that is where I would say, that is where we need a health in all policy approach. We need to really push for putting health in everything, in our architecture, in our financial institutions, in our policy designs, and bring them on into health. Bring them on. We need to collaborate together. You know, you cannot tackle a complex world with simple answers. Not going to work.
I'm mindful of the time, so I'll take one last question. What do you think about the idea of commercial space travel or space exploration in general and its implications on the environment?
We need to fix our planet first before going for that. I'm a big space buff. Like I watch Star Trek. I really watch, like, big space nerd over here, and I love NASA. I love looking all the cool missions they're doing. And by the way, we've learned so much from space, and we need space satellites to monitor our planet, and we've learned so much from that. So please definitely bring it on. But when it comes to commercial space travel, you know, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and all these people who have a fantasy of going to Mars, you know what that tells me? That they've given up already on on planet Earth, which is the only planet we know which is hospitable to life. And if they were in front of me, I would tell them, fine. So you want to go and build your little kingdom on Mars, which will most definitely not be a democracy. You want to build your little kingdom on Mars, okay, which has minus 84 degrees centigrade, a pressure of less than 0.5% of the Earth's, and no water to drink. You want to go there, but you don't want to work on a planet that's living? And I would say, and there's also huge amounts of pollution generated. For example, I read something like during the time that Jeff Bezos flew up to space and then came back, okay, apparently at that point it generated that launcher generated more pollution than about 5 countries' carbon emissions put together. For example, I forgot which ones, to be honest. Sorry for the scan details, but yes, it's that polluting. Now, can you imagine that turning into 100 a week, 1,000 a week? It's like we're just throwing our planet into the sink. And I can't stress how wrong it is. Of course, there are fuels and there are fuels. Okay, but many fuels, I know that the fuels that Jeff Bezos and that Branson were using were hydrazine based. And that is highly polluting and very toxic. So there you go.
Just one last question. I would hate to miss this one. What is the role of bioengineering in the fight for climate change?
Interesting, very interesting question. I am not hostile at all to the concept of GMOs. There are GMOs and there are GMOs. I'm definitely not a fan of, for example, creating a genetically modified organism that would, okay, maybe improve vitamin A, for example, nutrition, but then you need to buy the seeds constantly from that one supplier, which is causing huge problems worldwide, food security. There's a question of justice and social justice, etc., that needs to be taken into account. But, for example, if you create a plant that absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide, much more than other plants, and that could help us mitigate climate change, that could be great. However, we need to be careful of whether you mean bioengineering or geoengineering. I believe you mean bio. So bio, if we're looking at organisms, I am cautiously in favor of bioengineering if it does not cause damage to the biology, to the biodiversity around us, which is a big if. But if that is the case, I have no objection to it. But if we're looking at problems, for example, if we're looking at geoengineering solutions, I believe, you know, things like injecting sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, et cetera, to bring global cooling. My answer to that is you're creating a problem to try to, you're creating a problem while trying to solve a problem. Don't go there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cauchi. It's almost 2 o'clock, so thanks everyone who have joined us. Please continue to check our Facebook page for upcoming sessions of Cafe Sci. The next one will be held in October. We thank you again, everyone, and wish you a great afternoon.
Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.